systemic racism that kills, destroys, suppresses. He didn't mean just a few prejudices. So, and the Black critical tradition in this country, going back all the way to David Walker and before, has emphasized that racism is institutional, even before Magnus Hirschfeld did in the 1930s. But when the concept of racism moved from Germany to the US, white social scientists and other whites decided to use it in an individualistic sense of prejudice. So you get a lot of white people today who say, well, everybody can be prejudiced. That is not true. That's a false statement. If by racism you mean what the Black critical tradition is meant by it, and what Magnus Hirschfeld, who coined that word in the 30s, meant. Racism is something that kills. It suppresses, it damages, it's structural, and it's systemic. And I would add in the US case, racism is not only systemic, but it's foundational, because it's built into our basic institutions from the 1600s to the present day. And it's foundational in the sense of we live under a constitution today, 2020. We're the only advanced industrialized country that lives under a constitution made by slaveholders. 40% of the 55 white guys who gave us our constitution were or had been slaveholders. And those who weren't slaveholders were tied to them as merchants and lawyers. They were very supportive of the slavery system. Nobody at the convention, not one single white man there, spoke on behalf of destroying this foundation of slavery. So slavery is foundational, it's systemic, it penetrates all our institutions, the economy, politics, healthcare, and most definitely policing, which is what we've seen a lot of demonstrations about lately. So it's way more than prejudice, it's systemic.
Thank you, Dr. Fagan. Really appreciate that response. And at this time, I'm going to ask everyone again to please mute yourself if you're not speaking. We're hearing some background noise, and we would like to give full respect and honor to our panelists this evening. Thank you so much. Our next question will be directed towards Ms. Crystal Edwards. As an activist who is committed to supporting single mothers, what are the distinct needs of single mothers at this time, when violence against Black bodies is at the forefront of our conversation? And we also like to know how your organization or you personally are addressing those needs.
Well, listen, thank you so very much for having me. Thank you, Dr. Fagans and Chad and Pastor Mitchell. So I would first say that for single mothers out here in the struggle, the first thing is you have to have transparency with your children. Stop allowing other people to lie to them consistently about who they are, what they represent, and what their lives are going to be like. The second thing is you have to have the courage to tell the truth. You have to have the courage to be able to look your children in the eye and let them know what the world has always thought about them, how they got to this country. We have to have really, really, really deep conversations with our children as preparation to prepare them. We have to have the wherewithal to allow our children, our Black children, to be able to think, feel, express, and to ask questions. Our children cannot be victimized in the atmosphere of America and then not have a safe place at home to be able to express how they're feeling. And one of the major things that I implore single women, especially my single Black women out here in this fight, form a relationship with your ex. If you are not in a current relationship with your children's father, it behooves you to be able to work along with their father in order to create a safe space and a partnership for raising a whole healthy person. We have to stop playing keep away and he's doing this and she's doing that. There's no time for that when we are really invested into raising children 100%. They need both parents. You did not create them asexually, and you can't raise them asexually. They have to be infused and a part of their father's lives, whether you like it or not. It's for healthy children to be able to grow up with healthy space in healthy spaces. I definitely think that when I talk about, you know, having Black fathers involved, there's a misnomer that Black fathers are not involved in their children's lives. Research shows out of all ethnic groups of people who are not together, for men who are not together with their child's mother, Black men are more involved than any other race. Now that's research-based. So once again, there's a lie out there, a myth that says that Black fathers are not involved. And I need Black women to really understand that when we are raising children in a single household. You definitely have to make sure that there is routine, there is a spiritual base, and when it comes even to their education, allow a child to think and be able to express what they're learning without thinking that they need an IEP. Okay, so we're in a space now where our children are doing online learning and things of that nature. Children process differently. Just because children, you know, some children aren't, you know, classic learners in the sense of sit down, you know, be still, look at this book. That does not mean that they need an IEP. Some just think and blossom differently. If all flowers were roses, what would we do with tulips? Would we say that the tulips grow slow or the tulips need, no, tulips might need extra sun. They might need extra water. So it's certain things like that that I really want our single moms out here to definitely be aware of. And start out by asking, how are you today? You know, what do you need? Ask children, what do they need? What do they hope for? What's important to them? And by all means, stop telling Black young men and Black boys not to cry. They were born with tear ducts. Let them cry a river if they need to get in touch with their emotions. Okay, that is one of the major things. And what Empowering Single Mom is consistently doing is definitely make sure that we're out in the tri-state area meeting the needs of our single mothers by providing mentoring, by providing parental things shown to be able to make sure that the next generation of children is really growing up in positivity and love and being nurtured. It's okay to be a Black child in America, okay, and have the supports of a village, a mom, a dad, to be able to make sure that they are propelled into the greatness that they were born into.
Thank you so much, Ms. Edwards. Thank you for that insight, and thank you for giving us something that we can take with us. We have in the chat that someone really loved and appreciated your flower analogy. So thank you again. Thank you very much. Next, we have Reverend Marshall Mitchell of Salem Baptist Church. Reverend Mitchell, it is clear to many of us that this is a unique moment in history. Yet there is no consensus about the foundation of this shift that is taking place. In your opinion, what makes this moment different? Is there something divine at play?
Well, you know, you ask a pastor, he's got to believe something is always divine at play, that this thing isn't just on autopilot. So that's a loaded question for me. So obviously, I think so. I think one of the things that has made this moment very different is there's no identifiable leader. You have you had a spate of civil rights deaths that occurred probably on the run-up of 10 years to this, more than we've ever had in history. And many of their goals, whether it be a flag being torn down or the removal of monuments, or at least a real national discussion on race, which we saw, I guess, back from 92 to 2000, when you saw Chris Edelman and Christopher Edley, that they tried to have a conversation on race. It didn't work. Didn't work when you had a president. It was very superficial, very topical. I think Black people were as disappointed as other people were disillusioned. But all of a sudden, this thing has burst forth like a stream that none of us saw coming. You don't have living civil rights leaders at the front of it. You have Black churches which have been closed. And you see this collection of younger people who have had no identifiable interest in faith or religion, and many of whom probably would not be invited into houses of worship dressed the way they are. And it's happening nonetheless. So if you ask me, is this the hand of God? I almost say it's got to be the hand of somebody, because everything else is closed. It's not movie and art. It's not concerts. It's not Harry Belafonte. But all of this is happening at warp speed in ways that none of us saw. And so, the one character or personnel who doesn't care about whether it's red, yellow, green, or whether you're in a blue or red state seems to be acting as an active agent in human history. And so the cast gets very, very skinny for the collection of choices. Now, you ask me from a practical standpoint, I think we've actually just seen the water break, and something is being born that none of us knew was 9 months old. But now all of us have to make sure that the neonatal unit and the unit that takes care of newborn babies, that we're all present, we're all diligent, we're playing the role, like Crystal said, of telling our children and being very transparent. And then we're doing what Professor Joe said, which is making sure people understand that this newborn baby is born into a crib of racism and destruction. And I think if we keep that kind of transparency, if we're not engaged in litmus tests about who's going to be the most woke, or who is closer to the truth, or who's been taking a knee kneeling the longest, I think we'll have something remarkable happen that none of us anticipated that a plague-filled year like 2020 could ever bear.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pastor Mitchell. Next, we have Chad Dion Lassiter, the host for this evening's event, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Mr. Lassiter, understanding that Pennsylvania is ranked 8th in the nation for hate crimes, what has the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission done to proactively combat structural and systemic racism? What is your vision for the future?
Wow, great question. I think when we look at what Reverend Mitchell just mentioned as it pertains to this being a pregnant moment for our democracy, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to give birth to a new reality, to a new America? Are we going to bridge a new bridge to equality, fairness, justice, and truth? And so for me, I first start with the fact that you open, Layla, with W.E.B. Du Bois's question that the problem of the 20th century is in fact the problem of the color line. We can argue that the problem of the 21st century is the problem of the color line as well. Du Bois was in fact talking about white supremacy. And so when we look at this historically, we're looking at the fact that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission has been around since 1955. I am the 5th executive director. This, as I stated when I ended up taking this position 2 years ago, is not a job. It's an assignment by God. I found every reason not to go to Harrisburg. But when we look at the fact that white racism, white violence, and whiteness protects the mob and doesn't do anything for those who get mobbed, and the fact that we avoid conversations around white racism and white violence. When we turn on the news, we never hear anything trending as it pertains to white on white violence. We hear a lot about black on black violence, and there's no further narrative that articulates how that is intra-violence. And so when Dr. Fagan talks about the whole notion of institutional racism, prejudice plus power, that's the thing that we're concerned about at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, in addition to all forms of unlawful discrimination pertaining to commercial property, pertaining to education, housing, employment, as well as, public accommodations. We don't want xenophobia, transphobia, homophobia, but Pennsylvania, in fact, is ranked number 8 in the country with regards to hate groups assimilating. So one of the things that we immediately did 2 years ago is we launched something called PHRC Social Justice Lecture Series, where we brought in thought leaders from around the country: Tim Wise, Michael Eric Dyson, Robin DiAngelo, Ron Ronstein, Reverend Marshall Mitchell, and myself. We did an evening conversation addressing anti-Semitism and racism in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, and in our democracy with A.G. Shapiro. So the PHRC Social Justice Lecture Series gets to the underpinning of having a staff in a Commonwealth hear the voices of individuals who have pledged their lives to alleviating the suffering of racism, and in particular, white racism. We also, without just mentioning all the things we do, but just to detail it, we address those forms of anti-Semitism as well, with work that we've done with the ADL, work that we've done with the Pennsylvania Jewish Coalition. Because for me, when you talk about the future, it's a future that has to involve truth and reconciliation. It's a future that has to, for me, recognize that coalition building is essential. And I typically don't like words like ally. My grandmother would always say, just be a good person. We talk about baby boomers, Generation X. We talk about, this, and we talk about millennials, but just fundamentally be a good person. And so partnerships and coalition building in that same tradition that Martin Luther King and Rabbi Abraham Yeshua Heschel attempted to bring about for our democracy as it relates to the beloved community has been really, really important. Also, the work that we've done in schools as it pertains to working with multiple partners, whether that's the Department of Justice and others, to really deal with not this whole aspect of cultural diversity, which is important, but justice and equity, and making sure that every single day we check our isms. The last thing I'll say to that is that we've actually launched, ADL came in and provided training for our staff around implicit bias. We all come to a context with a form of unconscious bias, but every single day I'm very committed to not just the work that we do at the PHRC, but in the Commonwealth, of addressing the forms of white supremacy that exist, that are not, imagined, that are not perceived, but that are fundamentally real.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lassiter. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your commitment to combating those wrongs that have been perpetuated upon humanity. We're going to move back to Professor Fagan. Professor Fagan, through your decades of research and reflection, how would you explain our societal peace of the Black body? Why are Black bodies disposable? For example, why does
email me back and said there are no current jobs available. So
I would like to say, excuse me, Professor, I would like to say at this time, again, those who are not muted, to please mute yourself. We are having some feedback in the background, so please mute yourself. Thank you very much. I'll start from the beginning, Professor Fagan. My apologies. Through your decades of research and reflection, how would you explain our societal fear of the Black body? Why are Black bodies disposable? For example, why does George Floyd get murdered for an alleged counterfeit $20 bill, yet Dylan Roof, who murdered 9 people in a church who were having Bible study, is questioned and then taken to Burger King for a meal?
Those are excellent questions, and they, of course, date back centuries. I think if you look at the George Floyd killing, for example, I think fear was not the dominant emotion there, but anger, dominance, superiority, control, and that's been true of Black people from the beginning. When whites, those colonists in Virginia, bought 20 Africans off a Dutch flagged ship in 1619 to do the work on their new colonial plantation, lazy whites, if you will, right, decided to import Africans to do the labor on their plantation. Now, keep in mind that almost all the whites who oppressed Black Americans enslaved them for the next 246 years. 60% of our history is slavery, Black slavery. And it was good Christians. The white people who did this saw themselves as good Christians. One of the great ironies of slavery, right? They had Black bodies that they worked to death in the fields and in the factories to do the labor for the plantations and to create white wealth. Now, how did good Christians justify this in their minds? They developed what I call a white racial frame, a worldview, right? And in that worldview, the worldview said that these Black folks are not human beings. They're an inferior breed. We white people are the most virtuous. We're the smartest. We have the best history. We have the best language. So the white people, these good Christians, developed this frame which says we whites are virtuous and superior. Okay, how do we explain that these people who look like human beings but are dark-skinned, how can we explain to ourselves that we can exploit the hell out of them and kill them, right? Well, you develop as part of that white frame an anti-others subframe that says Black people are not full human beings. To get at your question, Black bodies are not valuable. They're unvirtuous. They're not valuable except as slave labor. And you can see that carries all the way through 60% of our history that's slavery. After a brief reconstruction, we reimposed the near slavery of Jim Crow, North and South, with that same white framing that you see in cops, like in the Floyd and other incidents, right? The white cops want to be strong, super manly, hyper masculine, dominant, in control over the Black bodies. And that view, we've now had it in this country for 400 years, right? It's the white view of Black people as expendable, as disposable, and of whites as virtuous and superior. It's a very long tradition, and you can see it in every one of these police incidents, right? The police officer's not just biased, right? They've got a frame that's arrogant, that says I should be dominant and in control. Of course, they see the Black body as inferior, but they also see themselves as superior and dominant, justifiably using violence. That's also 400 years old. I think another element here is where fear does come in, is the white fear of Black resistance. Since 1619, Black people have been fighting back, often killing the slaveholders, organizing slave insurrections. So for that whole history of slavery and Jim Crow and in the present, whites are also fearful that Blacks will fight back and do in fact fight back. So that's part of this too, fear of Black resistance to white oppression. And particularly large Black men, right?
Yes.
Have been a problem from the beginning because people fight back when they're oppressed.
Thank you, Professor Fagan, particularly for that framing of that analysis of the white frame, which gives us context. So thank you very much. Next, we're going to move on to Reverend Marshall Mitchell again. Reverend Mitchell, if the United States were to speak truth to power and to reconcile for its original sins of genocide and enslavement, what would truth and reconciliation look like? How
Bankruptcy.
will the people know that reconciliation has taken place?
Because we'd be bankrupt, an economically and financially bankrupt country. That's what it would look like. I think it's, it's biblical. And if you want to be evangelical and biblical, then you create a wrong and then you right it by something that offsets the wrong, right? That's even the Jesus message, right? He's the atonement for our sin. And America still is not serious about atonement for its sin. And I'm a very patriotic person. Chad knows that. That's my reputation politically. Councilman Jones, who is on here, knows that. I too sing America. But that's what it would look like. It would look like material bankruptcy. You literally could not pay the debt that is owed. It would be impossible. The dollar, the French franc, if you wanted to go back before the euro, the pound, which is still in currency, don't leave Brussels out of it. Spain, Portugal. Let's not even talk about the Americas, because we could certainly go further east and look at what the Arab world has done. That's the longest standing slavery that anyone has known in human history. 850 years of slavery. The world owes Africa and Africans a debt that it literally cannot pay. And I think that is actually some of what you're seeing right now, because the means to satisfy that debt literally can't be ascertained. My father, who was 65 years old when I was born, my name is Marshall because his college roommate was Thurgood Marshall, and Hughes because Langston Hughes was his line brother. My dad used to always say, my dad was born in 1905, 40 years after the Civil War. And he used to say, slavery made the world sweet and a race bitter. And that is what our pursuit and addiction as the West to sugar. We all know how addictive sugar is, whether it's rum or chocolate. And I think we are going to have a long road to hoe trying to figure out how to pay that debt. I don't know that we'll ever be able to do it economically. I'm hoping that America will begin to realize that it has a moral debt, which it can pay. That's the way grace acts in human history. But there has to be some sense that we have done this. And the interesting thing, and there is enough culpability to go around. So when you hear people say, well, my ancestors did not own slaves. Well, maybe not, but there is a residual effect of slavery and a residual benefit that people who came through Ellis Island still inherited. My Jewish ancestors still inherited that wonderful blank check that every white person has the ability to write, which can make any black person bankrupt. And if you think it isn't so, all you need to do is get a dog that you save and walk your dog early in the morning in Central Park and have an issue with a black person and go into this whiny voice by saying, an African American is threatening me. And that is when you can write that check, which literally won't bounce in America.
Yes. Thank you for that reference to Christian Cooper. I think a lot of people saw what happened to Christian Cooper while he was bird watching, and hopefully let go of their analysis that somehow if Black people would dress a certain way and speak a certain way and educate themselves, that somehow systemic racism would disappear. So thank you for that insight. We will move this on to Chad Lassiter. Mr. Lassiter, there has been a proactive attack on Black bodies since the conception of America. Yet it seems as if many people are only recently awakening to that reality. In your opinion, what is different now? And this question is slightly different than the question that I asked earlier of Pastor Mitchell. Do you trust that the response will lead to systemic change? Or do you believe that this response may only be a reaction to cruelty and police brutality?
Great question. Well, contextually, I think we saw a lot of this when we got the first African-American president of the United States. Our democracy was so quick to articulate that we're post-racial. Excuse me. And we know that post-racial is still a mirage. What we're witnessing now is what demographers are verbalizing as a shift in demographics, where at a certain period of time, whites are going to be in the minority. I think this white backlash that we see to the past 8 years and this white guilt, and also unraveling mentally for a lot of whites, is that white supremacy still will have a foothold on our democracy. The first 12 presidents of the United States of America owned slaves. Derek Bell and the work of Dr. Fagan and multiple others talks about how racism is permanent. So when David Wellman, Portraits of White Racism, talks about that it's not going anywhere, that does not mean that we don't wake up every single day attempting to dismantle it. I think what we have is a moment in which 35 million or more people were unemployed. And as I forget the rapper that said it, it was all good just a week ago, where everyone was working, and now you have people who are unemployed. You have a polarizing figure in the White House who's just merely a caricature. He's given a white supremacist blueprint by the deep state that's telling him how to act. He's not that smart, and I'm not, decrying his intelligence, but he's not that smart to plan out a rally and connect it to Tulsa, Oklahoma, or to plan out a rally that's going to be somewhere that has been divisive. And then in Charlottesville, he says there are fine people on both sides. So this moment that we find ourselves in, and Reverend Marshall Mitchell and I just spoke about this several days ago, is that this is a new generation, specifically whites, who are not buying into the racial divisiveness of their parents or their grandparents. So you see the trend all over the democracy and all over the globe, where white people, not just from a symbolic standpoint, are holding signs that are saying no justice, no peace, Black Lives Matter. And so I think where we're at now is people are tired of the rhetoric that's coming from the White House. People are tired of the educational apartheid, the institutional racism. They're tired of the environmental racism, the economic injustice, and they're tired of the anthology of police brutality. But this is nothing new for those of us who do this work. This is nothing new for you. This is nothing new for Dr. Fagan, certainly Crystal, certainly Reverend Marshall Mitchell, myself, simply because Tamir Rice was seen as a big Black person, when in fact, Tamir Rice was only 12 years old. Look at me, I'm 6'6", I'm dark-skinned, I'm bald-headed. It's not just unconscious, explicit, implicit bias that I bring to the context every time I leave Philadelphia to go to Harrisburg and travel throughout the state and the country. It's white supremacist ideology. So when Dr. Fagan talks about whiteness and virtue, think about the white female virtue. The white female virtue is what cost Emmett Till his life. The white female virtue is what caused the African-American brother to lose his life down in Rosewood, not the movie, but the book, the real life story. That was a white woman who was two-timing her husband, but she went to that white supremacist ideology playbook that blamed the Black man on her. You don't have systemic racism that says driving while white, riding your bicycle while white, reading the scriptures while white, but you have that with us. So our bodies have always been under surveillance. Our bodies have always been under suspicion. I really fundamentally believe that this is a different moment. This is a zeitgeist moment. When Reverend Marshall Mitchell mentioned this whole context of it's not a national leader, he tried that theory out on me, and it's a real good, it's not just a great theory, but it's a practical application. Think about it. If it was Barack Obama, as he said a couple of nights ago, it would be how great thou art. This is not Barack Obama. This is not Jesse Jackson. This is not Al Sharpton. This is not the fraternity. It's not the sorority. This is the least of these, quote unquote. George Floyd, no matter what his background was, he was a sacrificial lamb from something larger than me, which for me is God, that simply said, for a moment such as this, I'm going to use his very life to expose white supremacy. So I don't think we solve white supremacy. I think it's forever, it's permanent. But I think this moment is more than just a moment, more than a movement. This is momentum that's really starting to speak back to all of the things that have existed for the past 401 years. nonetheless, it's beyond the symbolism of a Confederate flag, Frank Rizzo statue here. There's 1,800 Confederate statues and monuments that are spread across the United States of America. Certainly, we need to put them, my opinion, in a place, i.e. a museum, to have a conversation about them, because that is a storied history. I'm a literary person. I don't believe you take out the N-word from a literary text like Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain. That's how the Southerners spoke at that time. But I think until we start seeing people of color, African Americans, displaced Africans living in America in the C-suite, don't just give us symbolism of taking away Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, but until Reverend Marshall Mitchell credential is in a place where he's sitting on the board that's paying money similar to what Joe Biden's son was getting in the Ukraine. And I'm a dear friend of the Biden's family, not trying to call them out, but until we start seeing people in positions of power, until a person like you is heading up a sociology division at a major institution in the tri-state area, it's time for us to fundamentally have this conversation around white supremacy. And we can tiptoe through the tulips, we can kumbaya, and we shall overcome and all that. But at the heart of what's wrong with the United States of America is that it is a diseased democracy that refuses to have the conversation around white supremacy and institutional racism.
And this is time. It's definitely time for that conversation to take place. Thank you very much, Mr. Lassiter. We're going to move on to Crystal Edwards. Ms. Edwards, what can Black women and mothers say to young Black men about what it means to be a Black man in America? And how do we support their mental, spiritual, and physical development?
Well, I think that the first thing that we definitely do is realize that as Black mothers, we don't raise Black men. We raise individuals and we nurture individuals. We birth individuals. Okay, for some reason, you know, Black women have been made to feel that they raise men. That's a lie. We raise individual male and female children. Men raise men. That's why it's important that a mother always has either that male counterpart, her husband, whomever she's in a relationship with, an uncle, her father, who is a consistent support and a consistent person in the life of that male child. You know, we play many roles, and historically we've always been the superwoman or the cleanup woman. Okay, whether in society, in our home, in our families, that's just what we have been tasked to do, and that is a lie. Because when it comes to our Black boys, in order for them to be strong men, they have to be in a relationship with a strong man who is holding them accountable for men stuff that we cannot teach. We can nurture, but we can't teach that. That's for a man to do. And not just any man. It has to be a man who understands what a man, because there's a difference between boys, men, males. That's all different. But when we're talking about a man, we are talking about a man. So she has to be able to be in the space to recognize that and allow her son to have that relationship. Okay. The other thing that we can do besides what I mentioned before is have conversation and loving arms to be able to hold our sons, to be able to have that conversation where we are listening, not talking, where we are listening, we are hearing, we are accepting what our sons are saying, because we have provided a comfortable space in which they can be unclothed and be able to say what they are feeling. That's important. The mental health of our Black boys and our Black young men in this political space is fragile at best. And we have a lot who put on the mask they're okay when they are falling apart in the inside and no one cares. So we have to be able to make sure that because young men, young boys need that space, because no one is asking, because just unlike strong Black women that we coin, we expect young men to be strong young men, like a Tamir Rice, who can't even go out at 12 years old and do what other young white boys do, which is learn how to shoot, play with toy guns. Okay, he wasn't even given the benefit of the doubt that might be a toy gun. He looked from white perspective that he was a grown man and he was but a child. So we have to be able to create those spaces, and I keep saying create a space that they can be able to say what they are feeling, and without demoralizing them or say, what did I say to you? Let them speak so they can flourish, so they can grow. Okay. And I will also say that some other things are they in a safe environment? Is there something as simple as a library in the home that has reading materials that reflect their history, that reflect their intelligence, that reflect characters that are going through the same thing or have overcome some of the same adversities that they go through every day? And if that question is no, that is the starting point. So those are some of the things that I hope I answered that whole question for you. Okay.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for affirming that Black men need to have Black men, strong Black men who understand what Black manhood is in their lives in order to reach that level. Thank you very much for that. And now we're going to turn it back over to Reverend Marshall Mitchell. Reverend Mitchell, what message needs to be conveyed to white clergy, particularly those clergy who appeal to evangelicals and hold on to white supremacist ideology?
You know, an interesting thing is many of the white evangelical pastors, particularly those in very large churches, have substantial African-American membership. And so they are in an unusual situation where usually between 5 and sometimes even up to 35 and 40% of their congregation is Black. If those pastors will members who tithe and who give, if they will listen and have honest and frank conversations without reflexive responses, they will hear their African-American membership, even those who are conservative, politically conservative, who are very patriotic, they will tell them that there is an epidemic of racism, not only in the country, but also many times in these churches. And they don't realize it. Oftentimes it's a theologically untenable racism. That is the triumphalism, where there's almost a bait and switch. There are 3 things that oftentimes get mixed together: a gun, a cross, and the flag. And so oftentimes in an evangelical context, those things morph together. But I think simply talking, I had almost a transformative conversation the other day with a dear friend of mine who's pastor of a church. He's South African. He pastors a church in the northeast section of the United States of America. He's got a 14,000 member church. Now, here's a South African guy who's 50 plus, who grew up under apartheid, who pastors what would be considered a large white evangelical church. And he called me the other day and he said, dude, I need to talk to you. Number one, because it's obvious that Black lives matter. Number 2, I have Black people in my congregation, and my fear from God is that I should be speaking to them and specifically to their needs. And I've got to do that knowing that I might have 30 police officers from my town inside of my church at the same time. How do I walk that sociological tightrope? Yeah. And I think his asking that question, he said, I am inclined to actually do 2 things: to fly a Black Lives Matter flag at my church, as well as a gay flag, right? And he said, I don't know if I can do that, because if I do that, will I lose people who are under my roof who I'm trying to transform and change their mind? And I counseled my dear friend and said, dude, hold the Black Lives flag off, hold the gay rights flag or gay identity flag off, and simply use your words in the context where you've got 14 or 15,000 people with 6 services between Saturday and Sunday to change minds. Sometimes you've got to fly under the cloak of darkness if you want to change and transform people, rather than just the symbolism. And I think that's part of what Chad was alluding to when he talked about statues coming down, Confederate statues coming down. Because if you pull all of the Confederate statues down in Mississippi, but you still have the vestiges of the slavocracy in Mississippi, you've done nothing. That's tinkling cymbal and sounding brass. And so what I would say is, for those evangelical pastors who need to be on the right side of history, and evangelicals, it's 3 strikes you out in the old Clinton days. You missed slavery, right? So you were wrong on abolition. You missed civil rights, and God forbid you miss out on this third one. Because my fear for white evangelical churches is this is the last opportunity that they will have to hold their children and grandchildren. Because after this, they faced a problem of the calendar and a problem of math. And I realized in my own church context, where I'm a pastor of a Baptist church, and as I was trying to meet, and we were a church that was down to 45 members at one point on Sunday morning. We'd been through bankruptcy. We'd been through the loss of a pastor and the firing of a pastor, and then other divisive stuff. And I sat down with young people and I said, talk to me about your friends. And many of them said, we have friends who are gay who will never come to this church. And that frightened me, because the role of the church is to evangelize, to get people to come to Christ, to come periodically to worship, so that we can be sent out into the world. And these young kids said to me, as long as the church is perceived as beating up on my gay friends, and these are people who are straight, these are young people who are straight, we will not be in attendance if we know our gay friends are subjected to whipping and laceration and finger pointing. We will not come as straight people. The white evangelical church is facing the same daunting future, that if they are not sooner or later on the right side of history, their children and grandchildren who are shockingly carrying Black Lives Matter placards in Ambler and Bucks County and Montgomery County will eschew a relationship with a church and theology and ultimately a culture that coddles racists, that tolerates and cultivates homophobia, that does not respect women, that denounces the other, and then tries to denounce the other as squaring with the message of Jesus Christ, who was born in the northeast tip of Africa called Israel. And then when it was time to hide him, you hid him a little deeper in the interior. But you can't wrap your head around that same Jesus Christ being probably browner than I am as a racially admixture person, right? Probably darker than I am, maybe with a beard. And remember, this is pre-Arab conquest of Egypt. So you're truly in the motherland. And until the white evangelical church deals with some of these natural issues, look, let's go back. You got to get Jews to deal with Moses, right? Moses lives only a fraction of his life off of the continent of Africa, right? He is an African prince. He is raised in Pharaoh's household. All of the traditional African religiosity that he would have been part of. And then I say to my Jewish friends, there's another problem. He doesn't even marry a Jewish girl.
Right.
So there's all of this complexity, this racial complexity in the stories. And unless you're honest with it, you won't get to the root of the challenge. And I think the evangelical church has to be honest about racism, honest about America's blight, honest about this sordid history, S-O-R-D-I-D, sordid history of the West over the last 500 years with race and its African problem.
Yes, it's time for them to be bold. It's time for a radical transformation for a time when they really practice what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. So we thank you for that. We're going to turn this back to Professor Fagan. Professor Fagan, in a society whose foundation is based on racial division, can systemic racism actually be dismantled? If so, what does that look like? And I know people touched on that from many different aspects, but from a sociological perspective, you know, Karl Marx said that his actual perspective on racism is that as long as we're in a capitalistic society, that racism and all of the other divisions are necessary. So can it be dismantled? And if so, what does it look like?
Well, it has been partially dismantled 3 times in our history. And that's the problem today. Somebody once said that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, but I think eternal organization is the price of liberty, at least in the US case. The first rebellion was the abolitionist movements in the 1840s and 50s. It was a multiracial movement, lots of Black folks, Frederick Douglass, prominent abolitionists, lots of white folks. They really got the ball rolling on a critique of slavery, an ideological and an ethical critique of slavery. The second organization, which was tremendously successful and is not presented as such usually in the history books, at least in high schools and colleges today, is those 200,000 Black men who volunteered for Mr. Lincoln's Army in 1863 when the war was kind of at a stalemate. And 200,000 Black men, most of them former slaves, volunteered for Mr. Lincoln's Army. In addition, 300,000 other African Americans, men and women, served as support troops at that time. And as Lincoln finally admitted at the end of the war, he couldn't have won the war without all those Black men and women. That uprising of Black men and women organizing as part of the US Army, right? Forget this Union Army stuff. This is the US Army, and the Confederates are traitors. It's no civil war. This is a one-sided attempt by Southern slaveholders to preserve slavery. And it was organized Black men in Black regiments that doomed their attempt to preserve slavery to failure. The third major organization that helped dismantle slavery, systemic racism in part, was the Black Civil Rights Movement from the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, 1960s. Most of that was nonviolent. Millions of African Americans were involved and some whites. Some of it was Black uprisings in the cities, anger, violence in the cities. But those Black demonstrations and the Black so-called riots, they were uprisings in the cities, helped to bring down Jim Crow segregation. Jim Crow segregation was a near slavery system. Again, Black organization dismantled partially systemic racism. Now, the problem, of course, is elite whites come back in and try to go to the default position of their being in full control. So we move forward 2 steps and backwards 1. And that's where we're at today, in my view. These demonstrations by mostly younger people, right, Black and white, are exciting. You know, it provokes optimism. But without an underlying and a continuing and a future organization out of this movement, we're not going to get much change in systemic racism. We need to get like a 1 million person anti-racist organization that can appear in Washington, D.C. every time the Supreme Court or the Congress takes racist action or the president does this racist white nationalist stuff. Turn out several million Americans committed to anti-racism, to dismantling systemic racism again. So all the history suggests it takes organization, sustained, long-term, often years long. You can't do it, as exciting as it is, having 700 demonstrations over 8 weeks. You have to organize that energy. And part of it has to be the re-education of white people. We whites are awfully illiterate on our racist history. Even the good whites, in quote marks, who are out in the demonstrations, those young people who seem to be anti-racist, they don't know our racist history. They didn't get it in school. They're getting a little bit of it now in the movement. But they need aggressive re-education because they've been taught that white racist framing. They've learned that policing racism is bad. But that same racism is in their schools, in their colleges, in their employment, in their workplaces. So this is a matter here of massive re-education that should be a goal of any kind of organized movement. What we badly need is another era of well-organized human rights organization to dismantle as much of systemic racism as we can.
So I'm calling for our next meeting together to be a conversation about how we organize in that fashion, because that education is vital to get to the root of the problem and to begin to move forward. So thank you for that, Professor Fagan. Our next question is for Crystal Edwards. Within educational institutions, the needs of Black students often get relegated to the umbrella category of diversity and inclusion issues. As a result, the specific needs of Black children, that is, developing historical knowledge, cultural esteem, and cultural awareness, often get ignored or overlooked. How can educators be trained to be more culturally responsive, to address the specific needs of Black children, and to contribute to the dismantling of racism within our educational institutions?
So I'm gonna say that question is kind of twofold. I think the first thing is that, you know, I always say that there is a Hippocratic oath of education that all educators need to ask themselves. And the bottom line is do no harm to any child. But with that, as an educator, you have to be honest with yourself. If you do not believe in the children that are entrusted to you, get out.
Yes.
Or simply say, this is not the school for me. Stop standing in front of children that you will not teach like you would teach your own or expect your own to be taught. That's number one. And secondly, I think that as a Black community and in Black homes, that's where history needs to be taught. I can't relinquish my children to a teacher to be taught their history that needs to come from my home. And I think that parents definitely share that want of how children are taught. I also think that once an educator has you know, asked themselves that question and separated themselves from education or that particular classroom, I think along with what the Educational Post put out today, it was a very interesting article. If you are a white educator and you are teaching white children, examine what it is that you are teaching them.
Yeah.
Okay, because I think where we are at now in America is not a Black issue anymore. This is not our issue to solve. This is an issue that white Americans need to be having with their homes, their jobs, their businesses, their children, and the students that they are teaching. This is a white issue.
Yep.
That needs to be addressed in that space. okay? Because Black people have been charged with, even in our death, you know, as we talked about George Floyd, when we are dead, we still are defending ourselves.
That's right.
We're in a consistent circle of always having to defend why we should breathe equally, live equally. And at this point, it's not our problem. It's not ours to fix. I didn't teach you white privilege, and I shouldn't have to fix it.
That's right.
Fix your own. And have that conversation with your students and your teachers. So I think that it's time for, you know, white communities to really have that very transparent and honest conversation, whether they want to or not.
Can I make a comment on what was just said? It's Anthony Phillips.
Mm-hmm.
Hello?
We're not doing questions and answers right now.
Hello?
Yeah,
you-
we're not doing Q&A right now.
Okay.
Go ahead, Layla.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Crystal. Were you
You're
complete,
welcome.
Crystal? Were you complete?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Lassiter, we're going to move on to you. As a Black man in America, how have the most recent killings of African American people, particularly African American males, impacted you on a personal level?
Wow, what a question. I think if the data corrects me or serves me correct, I've been knowing you maybe 2 decades now, and you've always known me to not be fearful of being vulnerable. I think this did something to me differently. I was in Ferguson with one of my mentors, Cornel West, where I was trying to tell community leaders to not buy into the ready-made playbook that when the verdict was going to come out, it was going to be at nighttime, and that all over America and all over the world, you know, folk knew that we were going to be engaged in a form of burning, because there's 2 things. You have personhood and you have property, and historically, that anger, whether it's cathartic, whatever side you trend on, is one of those things where they knew that it was going to be that, and so that the news coverage will focus on that and take the attention off of what happened to Mike Brown. And so I was working with young people around play therapy, art therapy, and music therapy in one of the churches there. The Eric Garner was racial trauma, seeing what he went through, seeing what Walter Scott went through. But this one, for me, was a form of vicarious traumatization, that all the triggers of everything that we read, for those of us who do the work, and even if you don't do the work, it just really put me in a dark place. I was really depressed for a moment. And when Crystal mentions the concept of village, we know that the African proverb says it takes a village to raise a child, but it takes a healthy village to raise a healthy child. And for me, I thank God for my village. I thank God that I'm able to pick up the phone. I've known Crystal for 25 years, and you know, she's I'm older than her, but she's my big sister, and I'll call her and say, hey, Crystal, listen, I need to vent. Being reconnected with you in this space, and I think the first time I reached out to you, the first thing I asked you was, how's Mark, your husband? You know, thinking about what Black men are going through. But it's been a challenge, even though I'm privileged. You know, I have a roof over my head. I have health insurance. I have money readily available. But I also come from North Philadelphia. I also experienced police brutality growing up in and around Hunting Park. I also lived in Los Angeles for a period of time, and both my brother and I experienced police brutality in Los Angeles. Then you have the weight of a commission on your shoulders, and I oftentimes wonder if those who are employed by the state, employed by us, understand what goes into trying to keep everybody a job as we're teleworking. So I live the body, I'm under suspicion. I'm under surveillance. I work in Harrisburg where I stand out, because of my height and the racial gaze. I find myself texting Councilman Jones, who is a commissioner, reaching out to Senator Hughes. Just last week in the morning, I called Reverend Marshall Mitchell, and he said, wow, you don't understand. You were the next phone call. And he can share the narrative. Like there's a African proverb that says the lion's story will never be known if the hunter is the one that tells it. He said, you were the next person I was going to call. He said, hold your head up. He had not known that my mom, who's 79 years old, was struggling because she never thought that at this stage in her life that she would have to call a 48-year-old man to make sure he's in the home and he's okay. And I was in an awful place when I called him for what we experience as Black men, what we will continue to experience, the generational trauma, some of the triggers of the stories that both of my grandmothers shared with me as they were domestic workers for whites and others, and what that meant and how they were subjected and how they faced racism, the institutional racism that I have faced, the blatant and subtle racism and effective prejudice that I face every single day, albeit I'm not buying into my own victimization. So I was despondent, I was dejected, I was depressed. And then what also happens in this position is that people fail to realize you're human. So when you look at your job email, you say, well, damn, not one person in the commission say, hey, boss, how are you doing? And some have of late. But you're a human being. But I always say, and you know this, my life is that of a gift. So as a gift, you sneeze and someone say, God bless you, that gift that was given to you may in fact be gone. And you will look and say, well, damn, what happened? The gift trended somewhere else to another calling. So I've been trying to make meaning out of what I'm going through, albeit I still have my life. So I found myself actually healing in the midst of an interview that I was doing on Canadian TV while the George Floyd funeral was taking place. His aunt said, you all knew him as George Floyd, but to us, he was Percy Jr. And then his brother spoke about how he was a metaphoric umbrella that protected and shielded everyone from the storms. His niece talked about scratch your head game that he would play. And then in that tradition that some of us come out of, that African-American tradition, she said he was from the Third Ward. And then so she likened him to Tupac. So I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, damn, I have not lost my life. But as a therapist, I do have a counselor on speed dial. And, I think that every Black person in America should have a counselor that they check in with quarterly, because we live in a life that is always traumatized, or that quote that escapes me, that James Baldwin talks about, to be Negro, is to be always to always be angry. So you just rely on friends and rely on faith, a lot of praying. So my Sundays are really about getting up in the morning, looking at my own church, Triumph Baptist Church, and our online service. And then I go to Reverend Marshall Mitchell's church, draw inspiration. Then I go to Reverend Waller, and then I'll go for a walk. I meditate and things like that, because I want to make sure that I don't maladaptively cope by shutting down and living in a pessimistic world, because I've seen a lot of this. And so when you asked the question earlier to all of us, what feels different? What feels different is the fact that there are more people recognizing the humanity of Black bodies. There's more individuals who are speaking out, but I'm also cautious, Layla, because as much as people talk about systemic racism and structural racism, and YouTube gives $100 million, and I fundamentally believe Ben and Jerry have always been woke brothers, the Ben and Jerry Foundation. But as people talk about this, systemic and structural racism are not new words. White supremacy, white violence, whiteness are not new words. These things have always existed. So I've been depressed, but I'm out of it, and I acknowledge it. And some people say, oh, don't claim it. But, if you have diabetes, you better take insulin or metformin to lose weight. So it's been real. And I just want to say publicly that I thank those who have allowed me the space to talk about being in the position that I am in. because you have to do this work. And so you have to compartmentalize all of this pain and still lead this agency at a turbulent time with budget cuts and hiring freezes. It's real, but you know, you use your faith, and that's what I use. And you know, I'm blessed to have a new big brother and Marshall Mitchell, who's not that far removed from my age, even though his beard makes him look like he's an older sage and a wise man. But I'm thankful for those people who are part of my village.
Thank you for your vulnerability. We appreciate it so much, and I'm confident that someone else was healed by the words that you expressed. We have about 15 minutes left, and we have one more question. I just want to say, knowing that we were on a time limit prevented me from having follow-up questions, and I've been burning to ask so many questions, so I'm looking forward to the opportunity to meet again. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Fagan, and then after that, I'm going to ask everyone if they have any follow-up words of wisdom that they like to add, and then we will be closing at 8:30. So, Professor Fagan, what is the best process for addressing police-sanctioned violence? Is defunding the police a viable option?
I think what people mean by defunding the police is radically reorganizing our policing system. Clearly, we have tasked our police officers with too many jobs. You know, they show up for issues that social workers should be dealing with. Some things they do are mental health. They're dealing with disturbed people, and they show up armed like warriors. And certainly the first thing we should do with all our police forces is demilitarize them.
Yeah.
You know, they buy this tremendous equipment from the U.S. Army surplus, right? And they all show up in tanks, looking like some of the armed warriors in a science fiction movie, right? That's all new, and we should demilitarize the police departments. We should also take some of these jobs they're doing away from them, where they show up to deal with a mental health problem and shoot somebody, because that's what they're trained to do, is with weaponry, instead of putting somebody out there who knows mental health issues to deal with mental health. So I think a dramatic reorganization of our whole policing system is badly in order. And if you historicize this a bit, many of the police departments, like in my hometown, Houston, started out as slave patrols. They started out as organizations of working class whites to suppress Black folks who might resist slavery or try to run away or rebel. And that certainly it continued under Jim Crow in the North and the South, right? Where the policing system was where we started, right? Policing the Black bodies against resistance from Black folks. So I think I would finish up with that point about we badly need organizations coming out of these demonstrations, large human rights organizations, which can do all the things we're talking about, re-educating whites, particularly younger whites, re-educating all whites on our racist history, making whites understand the problem of the 21st century is the color line, but we're talking about white people. The problem of the 21st century is white racism. And I think, you know, we've touched on this a bunch of times, that without aggressive human rights organization, we can't make much headway in dismantling systemic racism. Everything I see in history, it's been organization. Whether it's those Black regiments of soldiers in the Civil War or Black and white abolitionists, or the 10 years of the Black Civil Rights Movement, it's always been organization that brings change.
Thank you, Professor Fagan, for your final words. Crystal Edwards, final words.
My final words after this whole thing is it is really coming front and center that Black mothers pray differently, no matter how old our children are. And that's just the reality of it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. Thank you. We pray differently, certainly. And Chad Lassiter, final words?
Yeah, I was just touched because I know what, I can't imagine everything that Crystal is feeling, but something struck a chord with her. And I feel you, my dear sister. My final words is that human relations, civil rights commissions in the 21st century have to combine all disciplines into this work. We need sociologists, we need ethnographers, we need anthropologists, we need people in ministry, we need social workers, we need folk who are going to fight for justice. It's okay if you come to a context with your form of explicit, implicit bias, but be willing to unlearn. So like in South Philadelphia, where there are, our white brothers and sisters who don't see Christopher Columbus in the historical context that he is, those are similar individuals who don't want a Black person on their block or interracial couple on their block. And I know because I've done a lot of ethnography in South Philadelphia. So my last words is that everyone who's viewing this evening or will view it, let's not get seduced into the context of race, that you have whites who, as Joe stated and as Dr. Reverend Marshall Mitchell has stated, have fought for the humanity of Black folk, from John Brown, the abolitionist, to our Jewish brothers and sisters who couldn't teach at prestigious universities because of anti-Semitism, ended up teaching at HBCUs. So the beloved community is not anything that should be hokey-dorky. The beloved community is something that can occur, but we have to deal with white supremacy. And to Crystal's point, the beautiful thing about this whole entire evening is our spirits all touch, and there's a common thread and common threads that emerge in everything that we said. It's not the job of the oppressed to have to dismantle white supremacy. And may God just bless our efforts, because that's the most important thing for me as a man of faith, if my people who are called by my name. And I'll end with those last words.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lassiter. And I want to finish with the pastor, Pastor Marshall Mitchell of Salem Baptist Church. Could you please give us your final words?
Well, you really are taking a chance having a Black Baptist preacher go last and then asking for final words. I mean, come on, this is the Human Rights Commission. This ain't heaven. Be vulnerable. Say things publicly that are not popular but are healing and corrective. Don't worry about the cancel culture and being shunned by your own team. Human history shows that when people are vulnerable, remarkable things happen. Jesus Christ made himself vulnerable. He said on the cross, I could call down 10,000 legions of angels. He could have blown up the whole popsicle stand, but instead he chose vulnerability. If we're ever to get to a place of love, it is going to require vulnerability and not victimization.
Thank you for those final words. They really touched our hearts and our minds. I want to thank you all for this evening. Thank you for your participation in this discussion. We are grateful for the opportunity to share, to learn. We have all expanded in our awareness of America's original sin and the way in which it continues to manifest in our culture, in our lives, in our institutions. We have been blessed and enlightened by the knowledge and the perspective. We want to thank Chad Dion Lassiter, our host for this evening, and the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. It's critical that each of us find our way towards combating systemic racism, from joining the organization to supporting organizations through your time or your tithes, teaching, writing, or speaking truth to power. Whatever is yours to do, the time is now. The time is now. Thank you, everyone. And I just want to say good night, peace, blessings, and lots of love. Thank you very much.
Baby, here's what I was going to say to Chad. Where is it? I lost it.
Hello?